Okay.
But yeah, just to recap then what we were talking about. I remember obviously working with you, Lenny, back in early 2000s when I was at ITV in the Channel Islands, and we used to have a daily press briefing. I left in 2003, 2004, and I was at ITV in Birmingham when I first heard about the story at Haut de la Garenne, and I could see you were the senior investigating officer. Can you tell me a little bit about what happened? And looking back now, because it's kind of the 10-year anniversary, isn't it? If not a bit more, of what happened. You're obviously retired now, living in Ayrshire. What do you think now, looking back on that period of your time in Jersey? How do you feel now, looking back?
Well, I feel it's a pity that we weren't able to complete the job that we tried to do, and that nothing really seems to have changed in Jersey, even after the report of the Independent Committee of Inquiry. The roots of Operation Rectangle, as it became to be known, lay back in 2005, actually, with I think it was the FBI who instigated Operation Oar, and that raised some concerns in Jersey about the sea cadets on the island. And because of that, and because of difficulties that we met in trying to investigate that, it led myself and others to examine a number of files of cases that had gone in the past, including the Victoria College file and a number of other cases. And a lawyer who was working with us at the time was convinced that there was a paedophile ring operating on the island. Haut de la Garenne kept arising in all of the files that we were looking at, and these included scandals in the St. John's Ambulance Brigade, and there were undercurrents of police involvement in covering the matters up. So Operation Rectangle was launched, first of all, on a very quiet and discreet manner, and then eventually went public. Right from the outset, it faced political interference, willful and deliberate obstruction. We were constantly attacked in the Jersey media, which was rigidly controlled at that time by the Jersey government. We were attacked nationally by a journalist who had a history of supporting paedophiles, including the Leicestershire care rapist Frank Beck and the North Wales care institutions. This particular journalist actually labelled the North Wales convictions as the biggest miscarriage of justice ever. He was well known for his views that there was no such thing as historical child abuse. He had very, very close links with MI5, which might have facilitated a lot of the cover-ups that were going on at the time. But he later was discredited by admitting publicly that he had told lies. In his words, he'd been duped by MI5, whatever the truth of that is, and had told lies about the Iraq War. So we were under attack right from the outset. And that attack was mainly directed against the victims. And of course, because I was working on behalf of victims, then not only myself, but also Graham Power, who was the chief constable at the time there in Jersey, also came under attack as well. Indeed, he was later suspended. So looking back now, it doesn't really seem as if an awful lot has changed in Jersey. The Committee of Inquiry report came and went. One senior politician who was publicly branded a liar by the committee, who lied to the committee and conspired with others to justify the unlawful suspension of Graham Power. He didn't seem to have any punitive action taken against him at all. Another senior member of the government, who was also a member of the judiciary, was at the very least economical with the truth, and the committee said they didn't accept his evidence. Stopped short of calling him a liar, just said they didn't believe him. And both of those men are still active, and still, at least one of them is still in post, and I think the other one is still heavily involved in politics in Jersey.
It's for me, the reason I've got involved is as a journalist. I had the opportunity. I worked for Rothschild's Bank in the Channel Islands, but I wanted to be a journalist because I believed in holding power to account. And I feel that on my watch, I have failed the people of Jersey. The time that I was there, this was going on. But what can you do? How people put their faith in the government and the media because they have to put their faith somewhere. I think social media can in some way address this, do you think, where the power of the people and people can come forward and say, we've had enough. Children are at risk, vulnerable people at risk, things are being covered up. Do you think that could be the answer now? Because you've tried everything. I know you have, and many, many people have. What can be done?
Well, to be absolutely blunt, if it hadn't been for social media and two bloggers in particular, three, I suppose, if you include Stuart Silvery, who was a politician on the island at the time, whose life has been absolutely ruined because of the stance that he took in trying to defend abuse victims. He has been harassed, hounded, taken to court and jailed, all because of his attempts to uncover the truth about what was happening in Jersey. Him and two other very, very courageous bloggers who live on the island of Jersey. One blog by the name of Voice for Children, run by Neil McMurray, and the other one by Rico Sorda. If it hadn't been for them, then I would have been buried in the deluge of false criticism that was coming out from the Jersey media, directed by the Jersey government. No doubt about that, as would Graham Power, my boss, who was unlawfully suspended, kept suspended for 2 years, and then had to be told that there was absolutely not a shred of evidence against him. The lies and the false evidence that were presented against both Graham and myself were only uncovered because those bloggers relentlessly went after the truth and relentlessly published contradiction after contradiction to the propaganda that were being put out by the Jersey government and by senior police officers who followed Graham and myself into Jersey.
I'm not saying to people not to trust journalists, but I worked in the Channel Islands. I worked for the Guernsey Press. I also worked in television, and you do what you're told. You're fed the stories, and it's controlled by a number of people at the top. And I feel that I have a duty to get involved in this story now because I wasn't able to see it back then. But the power of social media, exactly, it's the voice of the people, isn't it? It's the voice of the people, and we don't have to just be fed that narrative that comes from the top, from the politicians, and the politicians who send their press releases and their communications department sending that information to the media. There's a chance now for change, and there's a chance for the truth to come out. I remember you had a fantastic reputation in the police force, somebody that was very well liked and respected, a senior police officer. You're saying there was corruption. I have spoken to people today about the bone fragments, which were human. They were human. I'm still looking into more details in relation to that. And going into the detail, you said that things weren't bagged properly. You sent off a piece of skull, which one of the anthropologists said was a child's skull, and what came back was actually a different piece of material, and that was a piece of material that everyone linked to the coconut shell, which is what probably people remember quite significantly from that story back in 2008 from the mainstream media articles, was that it was all of a sudden it's just a piece of coconut shell.
Well, the item in question was blown out of all proportion itself, because shortly after we sent it off to the laboratory in Cheltenham, it was bagged by a very, very well-respected anthropologist who positively identified it as a human bone and a bone of a juvenile, and she was in no doubt about that. And it was properly bagged, properly labelled, properly sealed, signed for, and taken over to this laboratory in the United Kingdom, who examined it and initially found collagen in it. Now, collagen is only found in mammals, including humans. It's not found in wood. It's not found in metal. It's not found in coconut. It's only found in mammals, including humans. So they found more than twice the amount of collagen in that sample that could have been used to DNA trace it. However, in the meantime, we had ruled it out of our inquiry because the area that it was found in, most of the stuff that was in there was just outside the realms of our inquiry. However, when it got over to the lab at that time, this was not yet known, they sent it on somewhere else without they opened it, examined it, found the collagen, and then just seemed to pass it around. And it got passed around several sources without being audited. There was no record kept of its movement. There was no record kept of who was in possession of it. And there was no record kept to ensure that it was in fact the same piece of material that we had sent over. So even if it had been a vital piece of evidence, it would have been useless to us when it came back. When it did come back, the anthropologist who identified it as human said that it was a different shape, a different size, different color, different context. And she could no longer say what it was without further tests. The suspicion immediately arose that it was not the same piece of material. We never ever proved that it was, and my successors destroyed it in any event. So we never will be able to. She said she couldn't now say it was human without doing further tests because it had changed so much. So apparently when it was being passed around over in Cheltenham, somebody who was not qualified in any way to say what it was said, "Oh, it looks to me like a piece of coconut." And there was the birth of the coconut myth, which has been totally demolished, not only by the bloggers that I mentioned earlier, but also totally by other evidence, which has been in the public domain for many, many years now, but which the Jersey government have just totally ignored. So that was how the coconut myth became. And of course, the Jersey politicians seized on that phrase with glee and used it and we're still using it even after the Committee of Inquiry reported that the Jersey government had performed disastrously in the realms of children's welfare and let children down throughout the whole history of Jersey childcare. They still insisted on maintaining the myth about this piece of coconut and used it as a stick to try and beat the whole investigation, which incidentally the Committee of Inquiry said that all of the police investigations during that had been carried out expeditiously and professionally.
And you were talking to me about the dogs that you got involved to help in the inquiry. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, Lenny?
There were two dogs under the control of a retired police dog handler who was very, very knowledgeable, very, very professional. The cadaver dog, which was trained to smell human cadaver, was a dog named Eddie. And he was a dog that was used in the Madeleine McCann inquiry. And of course, the Madeleine McCann inquiry, everybody knows about that, knows that the dog detected certain traces. Now, I think it was the Sunday Times reporter who said the big difference between our investigation and the Portuguese investigation was that the Portuguese police used the reaction of the dog to say that they felt the McCanns were guilty, that they got an answer from the dogs. The dog's handler continually emphasized that the dogs didn't give any answers. All they did was tell you what questions to ask. So the dogs undoubtedly found human cadaver at Haut de la Garenne. There's no doubt about that. And I carried out numerous tests with these dogs to verify and validate their reliability. They were magnificent. The dogs were absolutely superb. And they discovered, as they did in the McCann case, they discovered the scent of human cadaver at Haut de la Garenne. But that didn't tell us that children were murdered there. It simply told us that dead human flesh had been present at that location. It was up to us then to ask the questions that the dog was pointing us in the direction of. The dogs were a great aid, and they uncovered a lot of evidence, which unfortunately we were not able to tie down. We never, and we said this continually, we were never able to prove conclusively or otherwise that children were murdered at Haut de la Garenne. We couldn't prove that. We couldn't prove that they died at Haut de la Garenne. What we did prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, was that there was at least unlawful burials of children at Haut de la Garenne. And that was, we were accused of whipping up frenzy about a homicide inquiry. It was never a homicide inquiry. We had to treat it as a potential homicide inquiry. But our detractors left out the word potential in their haste to try and criticise everything that went on. So there were undoubtedly unlawful burials of children at Haut de la Garenne around about the 1950s and 60s. What we can't say, and what we were never able to say, and we're never likely to be able to say, was how they died.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think, like you were saying, the bloggers and the public have got a lot of power now. We've got the devices. I am doing this interview on my phone, and we've got the platforms now. We've got all of the social media platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. That the public can go out and investigate these things themselves and raise these very important questions. What is obviously very concerning is that, as you say, is that you feel that the vulnerable may still be at risk in the Channel Islands. I think that it's the people of the Channel Islands that are going to make a difference in the future. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Media.
Absolutely. There have been inroads with totally down to the bloggers that I mentioned, but it's still the case that anybody who raises their head above the parapet gets viciously attacked by the establishment in Jersey. Stuart Sivry is only one example. There was another example of two politicians, husband and wife team, who the Jersey government commissioned an inquiry allegedly to have an independent look at how I used resources during the Haut de la Garenne inquiry. And they issued a very, very critical report of me, but they never ever came to interview me. And not only that, I was never ever informed that there was even an inquiry in place. And it caused a bit of a furor amongst the social media and the bloggers in Jersey, to such an extent that eventually the government scrutiny panel decided they would have to have a look at it. Now, they appointed a politician who they thought would just bow down and say everything had been above board. But this politician issued a very, very fair report in which he blasted the Jersey government for dishonesty, for total failure in giving the investigating officers and myself a fair chance to reply. And he was very critical of the government and the report, and uncovered very disturbing aspects of the way the report had been collated, commissioned, and finally published. He immediately was attacked. He ended up being sued for, I think he actually, there were some very, very bad remarks made about him and his wife, who were both politicians. They sued for libel, and despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, their libel case was thrown out. They were bankrupted, lost their jobs, and were totally hounded. So them, Stuart Sivry, the bloggers were getting death threats. They were getting all sorts of abuse. Politicians were terrified. I mean, one politician who raised his head momentarily, we were told in Jersey that there were cellars where children had been abused. We couldn't find them. We couldn't find an entrance to them. And a local politician came to see us and said that he had taken part in the renovations and he could show us exactly where they were. And he showed us where the old entrance door was. We managed to find it and get in. He went quiet after that. He refused to give evidence to any of the inquiries. He refused to confirm that he had worked there, refused to confirm there were cellars there, and didn't and never raised his head again because of the pressure that he was under. So this was the sort of thing that anybody who raises their head above the parapet in Jersey is still suffering.
What you described, that culture, it sounds like the mafia. It sounds like episodes of The Sopranos. It sounds like there are certain people in charge and that hold all the power, and other politicians possibly are now too scared to stand up for justice and for the people.
The majority of them are. There, as I say, there are a few brave souls who have raised their head above the parapet, and they've been shot at continually. Hopefully that there will be more in the future, but at the moment it's really only a handful. And anybody who does, and if you speak to the bloggers in question, I think you've already, I don't know if you have spoken to Stuart Sivry or not, but the tale of Stuart Sivry's hounding and harassment and jailing is a horrendous story. I mean, Stuart Sivry was uncovering evidence of cover-ups about a nurse systematically was killing people in the hospital.
Yeah,
And
I've read that. Yeah, I've read all about that case. It's absolutely incredible. I've got the details, very specific details of that case that I've read. There are so many things going on in the Channel Islands. So, all right, Lenny. Well, thank you very much for talking to me, and I hope this recording's we'll see now. But I'm going to edit. Edit a bit down anyway. But if you got anything else to add, you think that's important to say? You know, were you retired? How long ago? 2008. You retired?
Yes, I retired almost 10 years ago now.
So you retired 10 years ago, and are you still involved? What do you think about Jersey when you look back now? Think about your time there.
Challenging. But challenging, but I met some very, very good people there, and worked with some very, very fine police officers and other members of the community. And my memory of the community is a warm one. The number of messages delivered personally and by other means of encouragement and gratitude for what we were doing. So yes, I mean, I've got very fond memories of many aspects of Jersey, but not of their politicians or of their non-elected officials, I have to say.
I bet. Well, enjoy your retirement, and again, thank you very much for talking to me about some more of the details of that case.
No problem, Anna.
All the best. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Right, I'll stop that recording now. Yay! That was much, much better.